Go.
Hello and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Lara Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is Sadie Hoagland. So before I introduce Sadie, thank you all for tuning in. Please remember to chat with us during the interview so we can weave in your comments and questions. And if you enjoy the episode, please also become a patron or patroness to help me keep this podcast going. And as I've said the last couple episodes, please also join me for a special workshop on May 8th called Prioritizing Your Craft for Writer Moms. We'll share strategies for prioritizing our craft, explore examples set by other writer moms, and write. And we'll leave the workshop engaged and armed with a plan for recommitting to our creative work. To register, visit writermothermonster.com and click on classes. And now I'm excited to introduce Sadie. Sadie Hoagland is the author of Strange Children and American Grief in 4 Stages, which earned a starred review from Kirkus Reviews. She's an associate professor of English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and the former editor of Quarterly West. Her work has been featured in Electric Literature, Mid-American Review, Forward Reviews, Writer's Digest, and many other publications. And she's the recipient of several fellowships and awards, including 4 Pushcart Prize nominations. She has 2 children, ages 6 and 2, and describes writer motherhood as exhausting, hilarious, real. So please join me in welcoming Sadie. Hi, Sadie. Hi. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I even did the back of my hair.
I have not done the back of my hair in probably a full year, if that, like the front is barely okay. So you look great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks so much for joining me. And let's start by telling me a little bit about your 3 words that describe writer motherhood. You said exhausting, hilarious, real.
Sure. So I think all of the writer mothers in the audience certainly can relate to the first one, especially if your children are still young, just never a guaranteed night's sleep, never a guaranteed 8 hours, just exhausting in terms of the kind of relentlessness of responsibility as well. So my 2-year-old still needs sort of constant supervision when I'm with them. So we're still in that kind of stage of all hands on deck at all times. And breathlessness, I would say, in terms of exhausting, but it's also hilarious. Even the exhausting moments are hilarious. Last night, my 6-year-old came in at 4 a.m. and she just stood in our room for a minute and then said, "My leg hurts," and went back to bed, which is pretty funny. Like when you're like, take a minute from just being like, "Oh, why did I get woken up?" You kind of take a step back and be like, why did that occur to her to come in? And obviously she was fine. She went right back to sleep, but it was just kind of one of those moments of the things that they do and say that just kind of give you a glimpse of an entirely different psychic world. And we have a book of, I'm sure you do too, of all the like hilarious things that your child has said that we kind of keep running. And so it's definitely hilarious, and it's definitely real in the terms that in a couple different ways. One is that I feel like the responsibility is so real, and you don't kind of get that before you have children. It's too abstract, I think, even though you sort of understand, yeah, I'm going to be responsible for these children. When you actually have them, it feels like such an intense responsibility, not just in terms of their care and their sort of physical needs, but also their social needs and their emotional needs, and the sort of idea that, oh, I am the person that teaches you this, and I am the person that's responsible for ensuring that you are you're growing in the way that's going to make you into a good person even. And so it definitely, and it doesn't, as much as I love being a writer and working with my imagination, and children are very imaginative, there is also like a really grounding sense of just the reality of caretaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I remember reading, it was probably somebody else's tweet. I don't remember whose it was, but it's kind of like you see your kid acting in a certain way and you think, oh, where's that kid's mother? And then suddenly like, oh, it's me. Yeah, and then it's like, oh, I'm the one responsible for reprimanding or teaching or all of the good things about parenthood too, which is better. So tell me, so you have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my daughter is 4.5, almost 5, so she's somewhere in the middle there. Are your kids anything alike? Like, did having your first child prepare you for having your second, or are they like completely different experiences?
There's a lot of similarities in terms of just they're both really high energy kids, and they're both really like their go-to mode is sort of just happy, which is really nice. But they are different personalities. Our daughter is the oldest, and she is pretty fiery, and she has been since she was a baby, just sort of like very alert, very aware, very ready to speak up at any moment. And our son is definitely more laid back. And I don't know if that's just like because we're more laid back, second child, but I do think some of it is personality too with him, because he seems so, even since he was born, we're like, oh, he's so much more mellow. He's an easier child. Like he kind of just believes us when we're like, everything's going to be fine. Go to sleep. He'll just go to sleep. So at the same time, he does seem like a little less independent than our daughter, but we'll see how it develops. It might just be his age.
Yeah. Did you always want to be a mother?
I did. Well, I guess, yeah, I definitely did as growing up, because I, just thought, oh, that's what we do. And then I think when I decided to be a writer in my mid-20s, in my early to mid-20s, I sort of didn't know if that, I thought that might be incongruous. And so I sort of, wanted to explore my independence, and I did a lot of traveling. And so before I met my husband, I wasn't sure that would really fit into my life. I was very happy, as I think a lot of young women are at that age, to just kind of see where everything was going. But then once we got married, we both sort of like, yeah, that would be really fun. We definitely wanted to get in. We got in a lot of like, backpacking trips and traveling beforehand. So we definitely didn't like rush right into parenthood, which I think now I'm really grateful for because we had that time together before we had children. And by that time too, I felt a little bit more confident that I could balance the identity of being a writer with the identity of being a mother.
Yeah, my husband and I were married for about, I want to say, maybe it was 8 years, 6 or 8 years before we had kids. For that reason, also, just because we wanted to spend the time together. I wasn't sure whether writing and motherhood could coexist, like you said. So it's definitely, I think, a question that a lot of the guests on the show have struggled with in the decision to have children, is whether they would lose the writer part of themselves. Tell me a little bit about that decision to become a writer you said your mid-20s?
Yeah, well, I guess it was probably as I was leaving college. I'd majored in psychology, but I'd been taking all the creative writing classes. And, I think there's a lot of barriers to becoming a creative writer. And one of them is that people tell you, oh, that's not a good career. Like, you're not going to make any money doing that. And so I just sort of thought, well, okay, I'll be a psychologist and I'll get to work with people and that will be fun. But towards the end of my college career, and when I was looking at like clearer paths, I really just kept coming back to, no, I want to write. I want to try it. If I fail, I can always go back to psychology. So I left college and started doing internships for magazines and doing some freelance journalism type writing. And it took about 3 years before I finally decided, oh, I'll go to graduate school and actually, get serious about this and take the time to really pursue it. So,
what was it about writing that drew you in?
I always wrote, even as a child, and it's really fun to watch my 6-year-old now. She's a voracious reader, and she's starting to like write her own stories, and I'm like just obviously like trying not to get overly excited and freak her out. But I just always thought I loved reading as a kid, and I think that when a kid loves reading, they just want to try that on, right? And so I wrote this novel when I was maybe 8 as a novel. It was on like stationery paper that had like monkeys on it, and it had chapter 1, the neighborhood dog goes missing. I think it was a 5-chapter novel, but I felt really excited, and I had a family friend that was a small town newspaper writer, and she was very encouraging, like, keep doing it, just keep doing it. And then I started writing plays for my friends, much to their dismay. but we would have fun. We would act them out. A lot of them were sort of fairy tales gone wrong kind of plays, where, like, the fairy tale starts out how it normally starts out, and then Rapunzel just gets fed up and, like, scales down the tower herself, and those kinds of, we see so many of those now, but we were really into those. So I just kind of always did it, and then I think got some encouragement in high school, and then definitely in college from creative writing teachers who would say, you're really, you have some talent, which is always really reassuring to hear when you're younger. Like, oh, that's, maybe I could do this, right?
Yeah. So what led you to writing a book, though? So you went from journalism to writing a novel?
Yeah, so I did the magazine writing for a few years, and a couple of longer form journalism pieces. But I had been sort of writing essays and actually nonfiction and fiction during that time. And then when I applied to graduate school, that, I think one of the things those programs do is sort of encourage you to do a book length with the format of the program, your thesis and dissertation and things like that. So once I got there, it was clear that they wanted, a book length project at the end. And by that time I was writing fiction. So I ended up writing a novel that I never did anything with for my thesis for my master's. But the whole time I was also working on the short stories that became American Grief in 4 Stages. And I started the novel not long after finishing. The Strange Children I started not long after finishing. Actually, maybe it was right before I finished. I started thinking I was writing a couple stories, which became the first couple of chapters. So I started that at the end of my master's.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to get to Strange Children and American Grief, but tell me about the novel that you didn't end up doing anything with. I think we all have a project like that, right? Tell me about that project and what it taught you about writing.
Sure. I think I had just read Sebald's Austerlitz, which is a very hypnotic novel. The language and the sort of rhythms of his writing just kind of draw you in. And honestly, I think any reader that's read that book and picks up this novel draft will be like, oh, look, she just read Sebald's Austerlitz. Like, it definitely has the same kind of rhythms. And so I kind of used the momentum of reading that to kind of start. And I wrote it relatively quickly. It was under 200 pages. And it was actually about motherhood as well. And it was, interestingly enough, sort of about unhappiness in motherhood, which I think is one of the things I was grappling with at the time. This was before I was married and was kind of in that space of how do these equate motherhood and writing. So it follows sort of 3 generations of women, and the sort of middle generation, the mother, was very had struggled a lot with postpartum depression. So she has a narrative that's both the most poetic but the darkest of the two. And then the daughter was a horse veterinarian, which was kind of fun because I got to do a lot of research on horse veterinary practices. And then the grandmother was like a very much like, this is how you be a lady type, very much modeled after my own grandmother. And so, and while that novel, I never got to a point where I understood what it needed to come into fruition. But I did recently resurrect those 3 characters, the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter, into another novel that I've written. And the daughter has changed quite a bit. Well, they've all changed quite a bit, but some of the tension that is between them, the sort of generational idea of how you succeed at being a woman, and the friction that leads between the 3 generations of adult women, is definitely still present in this new novel, which is called Circle of Animals, which I just finished a draft of.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell me, so if this book was centered on motherhood and you were in your master's program, it didn't have your spouse yet, what was it that was sort of percolating there about motherhood, and what were you grappling with at the time before it was even really a possibility for you?
I think what I felt at that time about motherhood was ambivalence.
Mm.
And I think I say this probably more than I should, but I think ambivalence is really underrated. The idea that we have many emotions towards something, and some of those emotions are conflicting, and yet we still hold them and we still kind of feel. So like, I think at that age, I felt very excited about motherhood and the idea of it, but also not sure if it was possible with my writing life, and also not sure that I think a lot of women feel this way before you have children. You're just not sure that your heart is like going to expand in the correct ways, right? Like, I think that's a fear that I actually have talked to younger women about this, that are my students, that have asked that they kind of wonder, oh, what if I have a child and it's the wrong decision, right? Like, they have that kind of fear. And so I think some of it was grappling with that sense of fear. And so writing a character that sort of expressed like kind of the worst possible scenario of just sort of emotional wreckage after giving birth. I think that allowed me to kind of think about that in ways that were both artistic, but also definitely personal, and thinking, okay, so what's the worst thing that happens, right? And to kind of, and to see how her daughter then, is an adult and is fine. And then also her mother is, kind of stepping in different ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I had a question and it just flew out of my mind. Hold on. It was about the ambivalence of motherhood and the wreckage. Well, anyway, I'll come back to it. So, yeah, I know. It's always at the end of the day, right? Like 6:30 and my brain is just completely melted. It's probably the worst time to do a podcast, but oh well. Here we are though.
When you can do it, yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about American Grief, and then we'll come back to the question if I can think of what it was.
Okay, sure. So American Grief in 4 Stages is a collection of short stories that thinks about grief and trauma from the perspective of this really beautiful statement in Lee Gilmore's Limits of Autobiography, Trauma and Testimony, where she says trauma is a space where language fails us. And so I sort of was leaning into that idea of, okay, what is this languageless space of grief? And why do we only have cliche to express our sympathy to someone who has just lost, or experienced something devastating? And so I kind of wanted to write against that. And so I started writing stories that had what I have come to call sort of an extreme language posturing. So they'll come out and sort of say the things that we never say. Like one story begins, we knew my sister was different after all the day she was murdered. So like a really kind of shocking statement of that kind of throws into relief all the things that we don't usually say surrounding death when we don't give details, or we're abstract, or we just sort of say, I'm sorry, and we don't have ways to kind of think about the narrative of healing and how someone gets to that 5th stage, which is acceptance, right, in the whole 5 stages of grief. But I think that book too is kind of expressing the idea that there is some grief and trauma that is not going to be accepted in the same way as others.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind me asking what kinds of grief and trauma those are, and if they were traumas that you were grappling with as you were writing the stories?
Sure. So there's suicide, there's murder, there's an overdose of a friend. There is much subtler versions of loss too. I should say that, like like I'm saying this because like no one's gonna want to read this, especially after what a difficult year we've all had. But there are moments of lightness, and there are moments that think about loss in much subtler ways. So there's one story that's actually called Father Writer, which is about the sort of the moment that you kind of realize like you've lost the previous version of your child. Like your child is still there, but you've lost the little one that they were, and like how that kind of continually happens in parenthood. And there are a few other stories that deal with sort of different moments in history and what loss meant. So there's one about the Salem witch trials and one about Aztecs that's the Aztec one is definitely supposed to add some comedy. So there's a couple of different emotions that you go through reading it, so it's not so heavy. But it was something I was thinking about. I had several people close to me that, including my husband, who lost his father to suicide, and my best friend lost her brother to suicide. And I was really grappling with being kind of the person standing there, totally unable to say anything that would help. And also witnessing how difficult, particularly suicide, is to recover from for survivors, because there isn't a narrative that makes sense. There isn't like a way in which we can say, like, oh, that's why that happened, right? And I think if there was a narrative, it was legible to a mind that was sick and not legible to a well mind. And so I think it becomes one of those things where a lot of the ideas we have about grief and moving on and recovery don't fit as simply.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how that book was received and what kinds of what kinds of notes you might have gotten from readers, and what the launch experience of that book that sounds both hilarious and devastating, and very rich. Tell me what that whole experience was like, putting that out into the world.
Well, one of the things I think probably that I didn't anticipate, but I was really grateful for, is that at that time I was going places and seeing people. And one of the things that would happen is someone would maybe have read the book, maybe have read a chapter or a story, or maybe have just heard me read, or maybe have just even heard me say, like, I'm ready to talk about grief. Let's talk about it. And they would open up to me and tell me, like, oh, I experienced this and I haven't been able to talk about it. And I'm so glad that you're mentioning how difficult, like, one of the things that I would talk about at my readings is that we don't really have, in sort of mainstream American culture, we don't have any kind of traditions like many cultures do. Many cultures have traditions that, you wear white for a certain amount of days, you follow a certain diet, these rituals that help the grieving person to kind of signal that at this moment they are existing outside of society, and to help others around them kind of know that as well. And we don't have anything like that. So a lot of people expressed a sense of, oh, we can talk about this now, and openness towards me, which I really appreciated. Of course, it was pre-pandemic launch by a few months, so I did get to have an in-person reading, which was wonderful. And I did get to do a couple of different events. And actually, right before the pandemic shut down in February of 2020, I got to go to Pittsburgh and do a couple of events, which was really fun. And I had some friends in the area that came, and now I'm just like looking at this, like the most nostalgic thing. It was like at a little bookstore, and there were hugs, and there was eating in a restaurant, like all these. So yeah, like this launch is very different, but for Strange Children. But I do still feel like I'm able to connect with people. I will miss the sort of kinds of conversations that happen, I think, for a lot of writers in that moment after reading, when someone comes up and says something just sort of astounding, or is really generous with how much they share in that moment.
Yeah, I definitely missed having that. You and I have books from the same publisher, so mine came out in September, I think, like right during the midst of the pandemic. But what was so nice is the conversations like this that we can have in a virtual space that we couldn't have in person, and talking to people like across the country who suddenly you can just dial up and not have to travel and get a hotel and like all of that stuff, and have really interesting conversations. So I'm excited to see what you do for your virtual tour. And Strange Children comes out May 18th, right? That's the date. Yeah. Now, I don't know if we confirmed, but could I put you on the spot and ask you if you'd like to read a little bit of Strange Children?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll go back to writer motherhood in a few minutes.
Okay. Sounds good. So this is Strange Children, and the plot of the story is that a 16-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl in a polygamous community sort of fall in love, and it's an illicit and forbidden relationship, and they're caught. And the 6-year-old boy is exiled from the community, and the girl is married off to his father. And a year later, she gives birth to his father's child, and he commits a crime in the city, which then kind of reverberates back onto the community. And so the community starts to unravel, both from external pressures, but also from a kind of internal strife going on. And so the story of this kind of community falling apart is actually told by the adolescents of the community. So there are 8 different narrators. But there's one narrator who is an outsider who's been affected by one of them. And so she's a ghost. And I am going to read, she gets the prologue, and she also has a section not too far in, and they're both quite short, but they both kind of give a top-down description of the community. So I thought that would be kind of a nice kind of setting of the story to read. So here's the prologue. Listen. Out of the desert silence the sound of dogs, panting, yelping, a distant barking in tempo. They came here that very week after the fire burned the prophet's house. Smoke curled up, then bloomed above the pink mesas. Ash fell like snow on the red earth and the temple and the houses of the faithful. Air burned to breathe. For days after even the smoke seemed to sink, to hang about and brown the quiet air, and out of this fog the dogs came. They came with tongues hanging out and dust frosting their fur. They came wagging their tails and strutting through the remains like victors. The children took to them right away, sneaking them bits of pig fat and whispering them names like chickpea and bone. Listen, sometimes things are over before they begin. So remember this moment. Picture it. A burned town, a missing prophet, a people wandering in the desert. And when it is over, I'll be right back here to the end, listening to the dogs freckling the pale hush that lay over Redfield. But first, the children. Listen. These strange children spoke the beginning and the after, and they burned the ends together deep in the marrow of our hearts. They had cleared a place for us, a place to feel for in the dark. And then this is another section that she has a couple chapters later. Listen. I am the ghost of the dead girl. I have come to Redfield to watch the end come as the beginning, backwards to get forwards, to die, to be reborn, to bear witness and then testimony, and try my hand at being the one who whispers prophecies, the one who asks you if you believe a whole world can disappear. I saw Redfield, half-finished houses and old ranchettes, skinny horses, nubby grass, sagebrush, and cliffs that went from red to white like puckered lips, as they wrinkled down to the mouth of the town. I saw them all, the children, the women, the sisters blonde Anna Lou and red-headed Emma, their brother Levi, who was overripe and you could tell had gone from too sweet to half-rotten as he grew, his sister Mary, his mother Elizabeth, his half-mother shrewd Tressa, and tow-headed Cadence with skin as white as snow. I saw the changeling boy, Manti. I saw him and his mother Beth, in her pain, in his pain, in the littlest one's pain. I wanted to turn away. I saw the prophet and knew I'd be back for him. First, I needed to talk to her, to Emma. Across our worlds, like speaking through wool, I tried to tell her what he'd done to me before it was too late, who he really was. I see her tender ear a cave in the night. I can waft in there past her thick red hair. I can make my body sound, my bones syllables. Once I am in, I whisper, murderer. I come out in time to watch her start awake, to touch her throat, to catch her breath and shiver in the bleached light of the moon.
Thank you, Sadie. That was beautiful. I was telling you before the interview that you and I were in an event together where I heard you read and immediately called you and asked you to be on my podcast. It was just so lovely. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's talk about the practicality of writing a book with 2 small children. When do you write? We'll just start there.
Yeah, it is not an easy thing, and I see conversations on social media sometimes from other writers who just recently have children, and they're posting like, wait, how do you do this? Like, tell us what is the secret? And I think I love hearing the different strategies that people come up with to find that time. But I have not found one solution that I'm just super excited to share and bottle and sell to everyone. I think when I was in that graduate school space of do writerhood and motherhood mix, one of the things that that sort of had me worried was that very few of my female mentors, who were just, who I admired, so greatly, very few of them had children. But one of them did. And I asked her, is it okay? Like, do you find time to write? Like, how's that going? Like, I just wanted to know. And she was a prolific writer and successful. And she kind of looked at me and she said, I don't find time to write, I steal it. And I think of that phrase often. Like, I think of stealing time. Like, I don't have the time. No one's going to present the time to me on a platter and say, would you like to write for 4 hours today? I just kind of find every week the little pockets that I can. And under the past couple of years, because of the 2 books, I've been working a lot under deadlines and revisions and things like that. And that's been helpful because when I have an authority outside of me saying, this is important, get this done, I prioritize it in a way that I wish I would prioritize for my own sort of creative generative work. So I have, I'm in academia, so I follow that work schedule. So summers and holidays always seem to present, and used to present before I had children, these sort of open spaces of time where I could get more done. Of course, that's not really true anymore, but they do present. There are times when if I can get childcare during those times, that's what I can be doing. So that's really, really helpful. But there have been times like when I was finishing the edits for Strange Children at one point, I just set my alarm. I'm not a morning person. And I just set my alarm for 5 a.m. because my daughter was waking up at around 6:45 at that point. This was before my son was born. And I just, I couldn't even I just would keep my laptop right by my bed. I couldn't even get actually out of bed. I would just kind of move the computer on my lap and just kind of sleep tight for a minute. And then I would kind of fully come awake to try to finish what I had to do. But, I did that for, I think, 3.5 weeks. And it got done. That's for sure. So.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I love that stealing time, and it's so true. You're stealing time from, or that's what it feels like anyway. I don't know if it actually is stealing time. It's prioritizing time. But tell me a little bit more about the mentor that you had in school, and now you're a mentor for your own students, your female students who come to you and say, how do you balance writing and motherhood? And you said this was when we were talking about ambivalence and about how your female students are kind of grappling with that ambivalence themselves. What do you tell them?
I think ultimately for everyone, obviously the decision to be a parent is a very personal one. I do think I think the key thing to note for young women thinking about being a writer and a mother is that I think that anyone needs to be incredibly disciplined to be a writer. I think that's something that I tell all of my students. You have to have a lot of discipline and a lot of ability to kind of go on despite very little encouragement. And I think all of those qualities kind of come maybe even more important if you're going to balance parenting or even just certain kinds of employment that's hugely time consuming. And especially if you add both of those, that discipline factor will definitely need to be there. I think, as we all feel, I think after you have children, you're like, did anyone tell me that this was going to be like, I don't remember anyone saying how much time and work this is, especially when they're young. And I think that, of course, they did tell us, and you can't hear it, right? I don't know if it's the pregnancy hormones or what, you just cannot hear that. And then when you experience it, you're like, oh, wow, this is really different. So I think, for me, it's absolutely worth it because I love being a mother and I love hanging out with my children. It's just really fun. But at the same time, it definitely is not, I have lots of friends that are not parents, and I sort of wonder like what they do with all their time. I have this like kind of secret fascination. I'm like, I wonder if they just look right on the weekends and then they just go out. Like, what do they like? It's kind of this foreign world to me. And so I just think that those qualities that you have to be in this business, just you have to have even more of them.
Yeah, no, that's actually great. Thinking about discipline and persistence. And not only do you not get a lot of encouragement in this business, you get a lot of rejection, like the opposite of encouragement, right? So, yeah, you have to want it pretty badly, right?
And one thing about that, though, too, is that I think I think before I had children, I let myself dwell on some of those rejections, or because when you have children, though, you're like, oh, that's just my ego and I got to move on and I've got to, make dinner. And so you kind of there is a nice sense in which children bring you out of yourself and your sort of weepy artistic tendencies, if you have any.
Yeah, let's stick with that for a second. Tell me how having children has changed you as a writer.
I think it definitely. Well, one of the short stories in American Grief is Father Writer, and the gender is switched, but the sentiment in the story is definitely something that I felt where I think I had written. I write dark things, right? And so I think I had written dark things with a sense not of carelessness, but I do think once I had children, I became much more careful about how I engaged that darkness. And I don't think, I think motherhood is kind of dark. So I don't think that there's anything I'm not one of those people that are like, oh, that's incompatible. Like children are all innocence and bubbles and flowers. I don't think that at all. But I also think that I felt like there's this really wonderful story by Edith Perlman where the father in the story, I think it's called Cantaloupe or called Honeydew. I think that's what it's called. But that's the collection. And I'll think of the story's name in a minute. Amulet is the name of the story. And it's about a father whose child gets really sick. And it's told from the perspective of one of the women who's a caregiver in the house. And she finds out that he's been like drawing these really, while they're kind of going through the baby's fever, he's been like drawing these pictures of like dismembered children and like shoving them in a drawer. But the whole, it's kind of comparing that to like an amulet. Like he's kind of letting his mind get into the darkest place possible so that he can grapple with his fear of losing his child because he doesn't know what else to do. And he thinks that somehow maybe that act will, serve as some sort of prayer or ritual that would sort of save the child. And the child ends up being fine. And but that story really spoke to me as a parent, that like there was a sense in which my writing, it didn't change tremendously, but my attitude towards it, I felt like, oh, if I'm going to write this, I better write it for a good reason, right? Like this is something that if I'm going to engage with like darkness or, really violent moments, I want to do that with a sense of responsibility. And I don't think responsibility to my children, but I think just the world seems a little bit heavier. Maybe it's that responsibility issue, right? Or that we talked about earlier, that sense of like realness to it all. It suddenly feels very real.
Yeah. No, as a fellow dark writer, I hear that before my story collection was published, I also had a novel that didn't go anywhere, and it was very dark, and it was about children. And I don't think I could write that same book today. Not that there, like you said, not that there isn't darkness in childhood, but just and I think I was responsible in writing it, but there was a sense of like abandon, right? That you could write when you don't have children. And then when you do, like darkness has a certain weight to it that it didn't before. Tell me about some of the fears or anxieties around parenthood, or the joys that you put into Strange Children, and then the next book that you just finished the draft of.
So I had done a lot of change children before I had children. So, but one scene I did write post children was a childbirth scene, which I'm really glad I didn't try to write that before giving birth. I think I could have done it with research and everything, but it just, I think I'm assuming it was better because I had children. I think that I'm trying to. So the next novel I wrote, I think I wrote it with sort of a larger sense of story, if that makes sense. Like I became, not that I wasn't interested in voice and language in the same, with the same passion, but I also was more interested in kind of these large structural story questions. And I was also more, and this comes in Strange Children too, but I think even more so in the second novel, Circle of Animals, I felt like there's a sense of redemption and like that things, it's not a happy ending, but it's not an unhappy ending either. And I think that some of the way in which that book is organized both speaks to the fact that I think one of the things that happens when you become a parent is you get your act together pretty quickly if it's not already together. And I think that's one of the functions of having so much less time, is that when I went into that writing that novel, I wanted to have like a plan, and I wanted to be able to kind of like, here's what I know I can write on Tuesday morning. What am I going to write? Like, I can't just sit and stare at my computer and maybe make some notes for 2 hours. That's not going to fly. Like, I need to use those 2 hours. So I didn't outline the novel chapter by chapter, but I certainly had a better sense of where I was going and wanting to use the time on the page and the time in my personal life in like the best possible, most efficient way possible.
Did that change the actual writing at all?
Like, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it did, because whereas Strange Children is mostly first person, so when I would sit down to write those, I would almost think of it as, I'm inhabiting this character. Where are they in the world? And what are they seeing? What are they hearing? And, delivering, kind of writing these almost like monologue pieces for these characters. But when I was looking at a book from a bigger picture standpoint, it was more like when you're playing with a dollhouse figures, and you're kind of moving them around. And so you kind of have to kind of figure out how to make those movements. So I think that's funny to say that, but I think there's actually just a lot more movement in the second book. Like there's more kind of, and partly because it's not, in an isolated cult community for 90% of it. They're like moving, they're going, they're driving in different parts of California. They're, seeing different things. They're going from work and back and forth to work. And I'm kind of keeping track of them in that larger sense way. So I think it must have changed the writing to that extent, for sure.
Yeah. Sorry. I wonder too if it changed the prose. I found, because I did something similar. I used to be very sort of exploratory and write by hand in notebooks and take forever to write something. And that's certainly not a bad way to write. But I found that once I had a child, and that was I just also finished a draft of a novel, and when writing that, it was very similar to what you're describing. It was kind of like, okay, I have a limited time to work, so I need to figure out what the next chapter will be, and then like write the next chapter, and then figure out what the next chapter will be. And I feel like you, that lent some an additional sense of movement to the book. And something I grapple with is whether it makes the prose less, whether it makes the prose more to the point, more blunt, or crisp, rather than in an exploratory prose. I feel like sometimes you go off on a tangent, you come up with this gorgeous line that you can weave back in somewhere else. But that's something I'm still trying to parse for myself, is whether a more regimented writing schedule means more regimented prose. I don't know. What have you found?
No, I think that that's a really good point, and I think it's absolutely true. But I have a friend who's a writer who says that she always likes a writer's first novel best because that's when they're kind of learning how to write a novel, and they're sort of making those probably exploratory moves that aren't really necessary and that they later learn they didn't need to do, but that are interesting, right? And that kind of create a depth to the prose that maybe isn't necessarily there if you're going from point A to point B to point C. So I have wondered that. I mean, Strange Children is, obviously all of our books have special places in our heart, but I definitely feel like it's the book that taught me how to write a longer piece. And actually, like, probably in the most complicated way possible. I don't know why I decided to like have 8 narrators. It seems like I could have made it a little easier on myself, but at the same time, I was so language focused in it, and so I really feel very proud of several sections of that book. And Circle of Animals, I was so interested in sort of one of the things about it is it sort of has an element of mystery, and I was interested in that kind of using the tropes of the mystery genre, but in kind of productive and fresh ways. But it does think a lot more about the reader, which may be a good thing, and the reader's attention too. And so I'm sort of writing with one eye on the audience in a way that I definitely wasn't for Strange Children. Partly because I think or at least for me, when I was first writing the novel, it took me forever to admit that I was writing a novel because I think I didn't want to freak myself out or something, and then with the Circle of Animals, I just have said, oh yeah, that's definitely what I'm doing. Like, absolutely.
Do you think that has something to do with confidence, that you've gained confidence in the fact that you can write a novel and now it's okay to say this is going to be a novel?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I think confidence, experience, all of the sort of ways that you grow as both a writer and a person and sort of mature. And, I'd love to like have both. Like, I'd love to have like the kind of raw sense of like aimless prose and the tight storyline. But I think when you get writers that can do that, I think Toni Morrison is a writer that can do that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That you get pretty extraordinary books.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question here from Kennedy S. Miller. She says, I'm curious about the multi-generational characters you mentioned resurrecting for a new book. So what was the experience of stepping into those different mother perspectives originally and now?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So the mother character, so she's the middle generation. Her name was Edie in both projects. And in Edie that I wrote in graduate school was like just a very dark personality. She was also grieving a sibling. She had a real difficulty connecting with her baby when it was born. And that sort of led her to sort of withdraw within herself, right? And Edie in the second book, The Circle of Animals, is a really, she wants to be a good mother. She didn't have a hard time connecting, but she also really, like, everything about the identity of mother just abhors her. Like she does not like, the idea of making peanut butter sandwiches. She would not be into Pinterest. Like, that's not her thing. She's a hippie. She's like very free spirited. She, wants her daughter to grow up and be independent and different. And so doesn't, make a lot of effort to do the kinds of things that, what her daughter always says, like what a good mother would do, right? Like, pack my backpack or get, make me lunch, and those kinds of things just aren't important to her. Larger kind of issues are. And so she is a much more connected mother, but she is also a large kind of ongoing theme, or even maybe an inside joke between mother and daughter, is the sort of inability of her to mother in a traditional way. And then the grandmother that you have is really similar between both books. And she's a little bit more peripheral of a character, but she's, kind of white glove lady, just very traditional in terms of this is how women should act. And and her daughter is a definite rebellion of that.
Yeah, and you said the grandmother was based on your own grandmother. Tell me about your mother and about you growing up and your grandmother and the multi-generational true life experience.
Yeah, so my grandmother, she died when I was 12, and so I think a lot of the ideas I have about her are more are very child ideas that like we have to be really polite and we have to do this. But I think she had, a very adventurous personality from what I hear. And I think probably the majority of what I was really kind of taking in as a child and witnessing the relationship between my mother and grandmother is that like large generational gap between, pre-feminism and post-feminism that I think probably a lot of families had the same kind of issue growing up. My mother is a wonderful mother. She is really inspiring in the sense that she's so generous. She actually has my child right now as we speak, my youngest, and she's been doing our daycare all year because we had him in daycare, and with the pandemic, it just got too complicated. And so she stepped in. And so I'm very lucky. And I think I think that her dedication to being a mother is different than the one her own mother had. I would have to ask her more about that, but I get the sense that, she's one who would never miss a birthday, wants everything to be just right. And I don't think her mother was exactly the same way. I think her mother was more interested in kind of a social and appearances type of thing, but I'm not exactly totally sure about that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You like don't know whether did I just absorb that as a child or was it real,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you have just fuzzy perceptions of grandparents, or at least I do, and it sounds like you do. What kind of expectations did you have for yourself of what type of mother you would be?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I think especially in this last year with the stress of the year, I definitely, and as my daughter gets older and there's more potential for conflict, right? Because they can make decisions like not listen to you, and it's actually a decision versus when they're younger, that's just sort of what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea that she can like sass me back and all these things are new to us this year. And I think one of the things that, I definitely feel like it's almost easier to say like, oh, in a moment, like, this isn't the mom I want to be. Like, I don't want to be yelling at my, like, I need to take a step back. And in terms of the mother I want to be and the expectations I have for myself, I think I want to be, sort of emotionally available is probably the most important to me. And to be able to be present with them, partly because it goes so fast, as like everyone always says, but it really does. And so to be able to kind of enjoy those quiet moments with your kids when you're snuggling and to kind of really feel that. And I think, one of the things that it's so wild being a parent, because you're like, I have all these interesting things to teach my child, and they're like, I don't care. Like once in a while they'll get interested in some of the same things that you are, but really my daughter is just like, her world is just everything that she finds fascinating, and she is taking that in such different directions than I did as a child. And some similar ones too, like she loves reading, but at the same time, it's really fascinating to watch. And so part of my expectations of being a mother have shifted, like, oh, I'm not necessarily the tour guide anymore. I'm kind of like along for the ride, like ready to give some feedback or some correction if needed, but really like they don't need us, I don't think, in quite the way that we imagine. And I think part of that is the age of my oldest too. She's kind of going from where like me and her dad are her whole world to like, oh my gosh, have you heard of elementary school? It's amazing. This whole like other, like she tells us jokes that wow, you have this whole life now that has nothing to do with us. And we only get the glimpse of it that you choose to share, which is particularly true this year when we're not allowed inside the school building. And and we could kind of see some things going on Zoom for half the year, right? But we weren't getting the kind of same sense of like, what's actually, here's this community, here's this social world that you're part of.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned when we were talking about American grief, that some of the stories were about like the loss of a child in the form that they once were, right? Like the little baby that you'll never have again, but you still have the same person. So it's not a real loss, but it feels very viscerally like a real loss. And I know what you mean by that, and I'm sure anyone listening will know. And you look back at pictures or videos of this little person, and it's like you miss them, but they're sitting right next to you. Yeah, so I think about that a little bit in what you were saying, that the more they grow up, the more they move away from you and have their own lives, the more exciting that is in some ways, because isn't that your role as a parent to like usher them along that path, but also kind of devastating because now they're moving away from you, right? Yeah.
It really is. It's sort of that it's that sort of mixed bag where you're just so happy, and like particularly with my daughter, she's so independent, and I'm so proud of that, and I'm so happy for her that she is completely confident, and I'm the one that wants to like follow her in the building, right? Like I'm the one that's like, not quite ready to let go of our like really, and I stop myself. I don't go in the building. I'm not allowed in there anyway right now, but I would stop myself because I want her to feel that confidence and independence, and but at the same time I've been surprised at how hard it is. It's like so difficult to watch them just kind of move away from you is a good way to put it. And just it's totally part of life and completely normal, but it is also just sort of like, oh, where's my baby? And she's only 6, so I can't imagine when she's 13. So
yeah, or driving, or ugh. I know I'm sort of dreading, but both. Well, I'm excited for and dreading when my daughter goes to kindergarten in the fall. And I joke, but I'm kind of not kidding when I say that I'm going to follow the bus to school on the first couple of days. And like make sure she gets off the bus and that she's not crying because somebody teased her on the school bus or whatever. But
you can do that. You won't tell anyone. You can just like going to coffee.
Exactly. Yes, I'll just go to the coffee place that's like really far away, but next to her school. That would make sense.
Yeah.
So since we have just a few minutes left, I'm going to ask you if you were to give a message to any writer mothers listening, whether they're new parents or at the same stage as you, it doesn't matter, but what message would you give to fellow writer mothers?
Hang in there. I would say, and just keep going. And I think one of the things I'm just so excited about your podcast, Laura, is because I think we just all need to know that there are others like us and that we're doing it. And and I think younger women need to know, yes, it's possible. Do it. You can have this. You can be a writer and a mother and a monster, like all of those things. And so I think that it's really important for us to kind of know that we're there are other women doing this and that it's completely possible, and to kind of keep that in mind, especially on those days where it doesn't seem like you'll ever write again because you've got so much other little things to do. And so I think I would just say keep going and keep in mind that there are lots of women like us. And I guess the other thing I would say is too, I think one of the things I'd like to do when I get time, but is to kind of come up with more resources for women writers and mother writers in particular, because I think there are so few opportunities. There are more so, I think, than there were 10 years ago, for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think that there should be even more. So.
Me too. For anyone listening who can think of opportunities or who has the funding to create opportunities for women and writer moms, here's a suggestion. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sadie, and congratulations on publication of Strange Children, and good luck with the virtual tour. I hope you'll keep us posted.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for having me. It's been a delightful conversation. And again, thank you for having this podcast and connecting all these mother writers.
Of course. Thank you, Sadie. And stick around for a second after the fact. I'll say goodbye.
Okay.
And thank you. And thank all of you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Come back again next week for another episode. And if you're so inclined, please become a patron or patroness on Patreon to help me keep this podcast going. And a final word, I've said it a few times now, but I'll say it again. Please join me on May 8th for the first Writer Mother Monster workshop, where we will be talking about prioritizing our craft. We'll write together. We'll leave energized and armed with a plan for recommitting to our creative work. So to register, visit writermothermonster.com and click on classes. Thank you again, and I'll see you next week.